system, we are talking about a system whose purpose is what? Sorry? Okay, but but why? Like, why have a brain at all? Yeah, I like that. The definition I kind of came up with was to sense the environment and regulate responses to it. To sense the environment and to regulate responses to it. We have an incredibly sophisticated nervous system. To the best of our knowledge of anything we've discovered yet, the most sophisticated nervous system that's ever existed in the universe that we are aware of. That might not be true, but we have no evidence of anything more sophisticated than our nervous system. It is a very sophisticated thing. I've highlighted things in a couple colors here. And I've done so sort of mindfully. Sense and response versus regulate. What does it mean to regulate something? Regulate something.
I think it is like balancing.
That's good, balancing it. I like that. What else? Keep it in control, yeah. Which often is balanced, but not always, right? Like usually we kind of want to balance things, but not always. Maybe you want to throw the ball, which is kind of different than balancing it, right? But yeah, often, I'd say most often, our goal when we regulate is to kind of keep things at close to a steady state, right? Versus sensing and responding. The idea here is that we have what we call stimulus and response. So this involves several subsystems. You could also say components if you wanted. But I want to use an analogy. And the analogy I want to use is your home's furnace. Probably your home has a furnace. What's a furnace? It's a heating system. And for most of us, probably you have a gas furnace, most people do, where a gas line comes into your house and it will actually burn like natural gas, and then there's a fan and it like blows that air throughout your house and you have vents. Some systems are different. Some have a gas boiler that boils some water and that flows through your house. Some have mini splits, but we're going to just imagine a simple kind of gas furnace. And so this is an example of basically what your nervous system does, which is you can imagine that it gets cold outside. Oh, look, it's a snowflake. Shut up. It's a snowflake. Okay, listen, whatever works for you, that's what it is. Right? Okay, look. Like, they're unique, like me. Okay, so it gets cold. Right, happens every year. We would call this, in terms of thinking about how our nervous system works, we would call this stimulus, a change in the environment. Now, assuming your furnace is already set up to run, assuming that like it's wintertime, and so you've set your house up to stay warm, what notices that it gets cold?
Sensor.
A sensor. And in your house, what do we call that sensor?
You.
Well, no, I want to talk about your house. Probably you have a thermostat. But a thermostat is actually two pieces at once. One of the components of your thermostat is a not stat, but a thermometer, thermometer, which is just a thermometer. Now, the thermometer in your thermostat isn't actually full of red alcohol or mercury. In fact, if you have an older thermostat, it'll be full, its thermometer is made of a coil of a bimetallic strip. And if you have a more modern thermostat, it would be an electronic thermometer. It would be just a electronic sensor. But what we notice is that the temperature drops, right? In fact, I'm going to show the temperature dropping. I have regrets here. I'm going to show it dropping. You don't have to worry, but as you know, I'm a very serious artist. So I'm going to show that it was here and it's dropped.
Oh, that looks great.
That's pretty good, right? Yeah, I'm pretty good. So there we go. The temperature is dropped. So this gets detected, all right? So the low temp is detected.
Please excuse this interruption. If you have Tay or Ravina with you, could they come to guidance?
Oh, no, I don't actually. Not present.
Any chance I could have Sarah Chow?
Yep.
Thank you.
I heard, is there a spare channel? Sarah Chow, got it. Okay, that's not a spare channel at all. That sounds like McGlynn. Are they looking for you in guidance?
Probably. Right now?
I don't know. Why don't you go now? See what happens. Okay, so the low temperature is detected, and this is what we call a receptor. Or sometimes we might call it a sensor. Okay, but a thermometer doesn't do anything. It just tells you what the temperature is. A thermostat has a thermometer in it, but it also has a circuit of some sort. Again, if you have an older one, it's this wonderful, gorgeously mechanical system that just works beautifully. And then now, everything is just a microcontroller running a 6502 processor that, tells it what to do, and it's very boring computer controlled. But having said that, what does your thermostat do? Well, when the thermometer gets low, it has a circuit that says what? So we've got a little device, and it's like circuitry. Oh, look, it's circuits. And there's more circuitry in there. So we have a controller, right? So we have the thermostat receives signals, processes them, and sends a signal. And in the case of your thermostat, what does it send signals to? The furnace. And of course, your furnace is this gas-powered device that burns gas. I don't know how to draw that, so I'm going to draw a pile of logs on fire. Maybe an old-fashioned furnace. Oh, look, we're on fire. Oh, hey. Very good artist. Try not to be intimidated by my beautiful art. Right? I wouldn't want to make Middleton feel bad, or what's the other one's name? I can't remember her name. Yes, what's her name? Okay, and we call this the regulator, or sometimes we call it the integrator. We'll talk about why those terms and what they mean. And then we would call this the response. All right, and then notably, what happens after that? Well, what happens is the thermostat is going to do what? Well, now we're pumping heat all through the house. The thermostat's going to rise back up, right? The thermometer inside your thermostat, because our thermostat is two components. It's the thermometer and it's a regulator. So the change is detected. And that would send back to the regulator. And I'm going to stop here. But of course, what will the regulator do when the change is big enough? Once the house is hot enough, what will it do?
Shut off the furnace.
It'll shut off the furnace. So we re-regulate, and this goes on and on and on. Does that make sense? In other words, this actually forms a loop. Does that make sense? If anything, you can think of this as coming back to here, which the response serves as its own stimulus, and then we can kind of re-regulate there. But this is the idea of what we would call a sensory response system. So we have something happen in the environment. We have a system whose job it is to receive that information, to sense that information about the environment around us. We have another system whose job is to decide what to do with that information. And then it sends signals to the part that actually does the changing. And then the original sensor, or maybe new sensors, notice that change and respond to that change. And this carries on and carries on. Does that make sense? Again, this is a fairly simple example of how a thermostat works, but this is how your body works too, right? Surely you've had your reflexes checked at some point, right? You get a little tap on the knee, on the patella. What happens? Yeah, if somebody wants to tap the patella of the person next to them right now, with their permission, of course. It helps. You want like sort of a fine point. What do we call that? We call that a reflex reaction, right? But what is happening here is there's some change in the environment. There's a force applied to the patella. There's a receptor, which in this case is just a bundle of nerves there that detect this force. They have a job, which is when the force gets high enough, fast enough, it sends a signal to your muscle saying, hey, contract, kick out. And then your leg kicks out. Does that make sense? So that's just a simple example there, but it's one that works. So I want to go back to this idea of sensing, responsing, and regulating. The furnace and the thermostat are example of these sensory and response neurons, and they are distinctly different from the regulatory system. And your body is like this too. We have materials whose job it is to gather and send information, but then we have another system whose job it is to process that information. And that is a key and important thing. In the human body, what is the main processing center that processes information? The brain. The brain doesn't gather much information, right? If you touch a burning hot stove element, it's not your brain that is detecting that's hot. It is sensors in your skin that are detecting that's hot. But where do they send that information? To the brain. So your brain can decide what to do with that information. Does that make sense? And likewise, when you decide you're going to run down the road, because you signed up for a marathon, your brain does the deciding that you're going to do that, and it waits and listens for the starting gun, and your ears detect the starting gun sound. They send that information to the brain, but the brain doesn't start moving. The brain sends signals to the legs to make them move. Does that make sense? So the brain doesn't do much of anything in your body, but what it does is it tells other things what to do, and it does that based on other things telling them what's going on around them. They receive input, they process the input, and they send out signals that cause other things to do. Yeah?
Can you go up quickly so I can see the colors that you have?
Yes. So, what to do with this? Well, I want to define these things. I talk too much, but that's okay. Instead of breaking there, I'm going to break there. We'll be good. Okay. So I want to lay out the nervous system. And don't worry, you'll get a chance to see those colors again if you didn't get earlier, because the nervous system on the whole, we divide into two major categories. One that collects information and one that processes information. Or I should say one that moves information and one that controls information. And these, of course, have to work together. So again, the main thing that is involved in processing is our brain. There you're going to see it's not the only thing involved in processing. But we say that what part of our nervous system is that? The brain and the other things. We call it the central nervous system. And that's what we're going to do in that highlight kind of yellow. This idea that your central nervous system is where information is processed. And we said the main place that happens is? Yeah, so the main thing here is the brain, the brain stem. But there are also certain points on the spinal cord. Does anyone know what we call the portion of the nervous system that is responsible not for deciding what to do with information, but actually gathering and moving information? Sorry? Yeah, very good. The peripheral nervous system. Very good. Look at you. Did you guys do this last year?
No, it's the thing. That's not developed course, Cam? Yeah. Can you develop a course? Yeah.
Are you learning this there? Okay, good. Probably they'll do a better job than I will, but that's okay. This can supplement that, hopefully. All right. So the central nervous system is involved in processing. The peripheral nervous system is involved in moving information. But information moves two ways. What are the two ways information moves? That's how it moves directionally. Just simply directionally.
To the brain or away?
To the brain or
Away.
away from the brain. Good. So we're going to give those separate names. So we're going to branch this off as well. And we're going to say that we can move towards the central nervous system or away from. And if we move towards the central nervous system, that's getting information to the brain that it can use. So we call this the sensory system or sensory pathways. On the other hand, and this name isn't ideal because it implies that it implies something that isn't quite true. But we call this one the motor pathway. I don't love the name motor pathway. Sensory pathway I think is pretty good. Because what it means is that when we have sensory information, whether it's temperature, whether it's texture, whether you're being touched or not, whether something is wet or dry, whatever it may be, that information, if it's your eyes, how bright the light is, what color the light is, in each spot in your vision. All that information gets sent down sensory pathways to the central nervous system. But then, when the brain decides to do something, when the brain sends information, it sends it down what we call motor pathways. Now, the name for that is because what is the brain often controlling? Yeah, and what makes us motor? What makes us motile? What makes us move? Muscles, yeah. So often the brain is sending information to muscles, but it doesn't have to be muscles. Does that make sense? The brain can also send information to glands. The brain can also send information to other things. So motor is a bit of a deceptive term, but that's okay. And then within the motor pathway, we actually have two distinct subcategories yet again. Because, ready, look at me. Your breathing is now under your conscious control.
Okay.
Try to just breathe regularly. You're welcome. What are you now all doing?
Annually breathing.
Annually breathing. But that's okay because I want you to stop thinking about that for a little bit and think about lemons and salt and vinegar chips. What's happening now? Think about lemons and salt and vinegar chips and maybe limes and maybe sour keys and maybe Sour Patch Kids and maybe lemonade, maybe a nice key lime pie. What's happening now?
I have key lime pie yogurt.
Multitask. What's that? You getting hungry? Sure. Anyone salivating? Yeah, me too. Did you think, hey, I want to salivate right now? On the other hand, gently smack the head of the person sitting next to you. Listen, guys, whatever I said, that was a choice, right? You may not have chosen to start, listen, you may not have chosen to breathe weird. You may not have chosen to start salivating. I can't make you hit somebody. That's on you. Not responsible. But do you see the difference? It is hard to salivate on demand. You kind of have to trick your body into doing it, right? You can like start swallowing a bit or whatever, but it's not actually directly under your control. Breathing is weird because it can actually be under your direct control, but most of the time it isn't. It's a weird one. Whereas like your stomach muscles going, not at all under your control. Not up to you, right? You cannot think, all right, stomach, start churning. Doesn't work that way, right? You have some weird ones, right? Like your sphincter valves are mostly completely autonomic, right? Like you normally don't have to think about, all right, I'm swallowing, so I better let some food into my stomach, open up that, what do we call the valve at the top of the stomach? 2 names. Cardiac sphincter, or same thing, different name? Esophageal sphincter. Good. You don't have to think about opening that. But then, obviously, like the anal sphincter is under your direct control, right? You choose when to act with that one, except when you don't, right? So some things are under your direct control, some things are not under your direct control, and some things spend a bit of time in both systems, but we give these distinct names. So we say sometimes under conscious control, and sometimes we say that these are automatic, so not under control. And again, things can exist in both worlds. Breathing is a great example, right? Breathing can be both fully consciously controlled and it can be fully subconscious. It can be fully not controlled by you at all. So what do we call these? Well, if it's automatic, we call it the autonomic nervous system. Does anyone know what we call the other? We've used this word before in an entirely different context to just mean kind of regular, normal stuff. When did we use that term otherwise? Somatic cells, which are contrasted with what types of cells? Sex cells, right? We had sex cells and somatic cells. So somatic cells are just kind of regular cells. The somatic nervous system is kind of the regular things we think of, the things that are under our conscious control, as separate from our autonomic system, which are things that aren't under our conscious control, that just happen to us. Okay, I'm not going to write paragraphs about all this because I think it's unnecessary. Is that okay? We cool with that? All right. What I do want to look at, though, is the primary cells of the nervous system. What are they called?
Neurons.
Neurons is correct. Very good.
Is there any subcategories of sensory pathways?
I mean, there's a million subcategories of sensory pathways. In terms of you have stretch sensors, you have heat sensors, you have optic sensors. So yeah, a million, but we're, again, very time limited in how we're going to approach the nervous system in this course. Kind of a day and a half sort of thing. All right, so neurons send and receive signals. A neuron is the equivalent of a wire in a circuit, right? Information gets applied to one end of it, and it will move that information along to the other end of it. Big old wires. Now, the wires in a computer circuit, which are often real wires, but sometimes are little bits of copper embedded on a PCB, a printed circuit board, or may even be, boron-doped silicon inside of a single chip. But all the same, what do? They carry what kind of signal? In a computer, to our lights, to our projectors. How do they carry? What do they carry? Electricity. What are the signals in our neurons? They're also electricity. That's a little different because we carry electrical signals using metal, right? Because metal is a conductor, right? Your body is conductive, but it's not very conductive. You do conduct electricity. If you've ever accidentally touched a live electrical wire, Yeah, it conducts. It can hurt you. It can hurt you pretty good. I did once. It was not a good feeling. Would not recommend. But the signals are electric in nature, are electrical. But they're produced by the movement of charged particles. What do we call charged particles, chem students? Ions, very good. In or out of the neuron. Okay, so the signals are electrical, but they're not produced by applying electrical current to a metal wire. Instead, they're produced by the movement of charged particles in or out of the neurons by active transport. So they actually have pumps in the membranes of the neuron, and their job is, when they're told to, pump a bunch of ions in both directions so that you create a charge across the neuron. And when that happens, well, we'll talk about it. That signal can be propagated. There are also non-signal sending cells, and these are called glial cells. So in our nervous system, we have neurons that send and receive signals, and we have glial cells whose job is to kind of support neurons. They handle waste, they provide energy, things like that. They provide structure. But we're not too worried about them. Instead, we are worried about neurons. So let's introduce you to your friend, the neuron. All right. Is everyone ready for some beautiful art? Okay, let's imagine we have a basic cell here, and it's got a nucleus, and it's full of fluid. What do we call the fluid inside of a cell?
Cytoplasm?
Yeah, it's full of cytoplasm, and it's got a nucleus, and what's in the nucleus? DNA, RNA, whatever. In this case, it's a human neuron, so it's going to be DNA. How many chromosomes? But since this isn't actively procreating, will we see chromosomes like that? No, that would only happen if it was nearing the end of interphase. But neurons don't procreate. They get produced from stem cells. So it's just going to look all chromatin-y, right? There it is. Okay, this is called the cell body. But neurons need to send signals. And so neurons have these enormously long tubes coming off of them that are just an extension of the cell. And I should not have drawn a hard line in here, but I'm going to be... All right, and they aren't actually a different color. I'm just trying to help differentiate here. All right, they're not green and blue, I promise. But we call this the axon. And the axon of a nerve can be quite long. But the axon is responsible for carrying the electrochemical signal. All right, and signals move down the axon of a nerve. So the signal is produced starting at the cell body, and it flows down the nerve. We'll talk about how that happens a little bit tomorrow. Is that true? Yeah, we won't get there till tomorrow, and that's okay. But how does the cell body know when to send a signal? Does it just decide to do that at random?
Isn't it like almost the brain?
Yeah, something has to tell it. Depending on what kind of nerve it is, it could be the brain says, okay, time. Mind you, the brain is just a collection of nerves, which is an interesting thing. So it takes a nerve to make another nerve do something. What made the first nerve do something? But say this was a heat sensor in your skin, well, maybe the signal comes from being too hot. But all the same, whatever it is, every nerve has a single axon, a single place where it sends information, but they tend to have many, many, many places where they collect information. And so they have these branched kind of signals that can go out like this, and these are abysmal, and I understand that like my art skills leave something to be desired, but we get these kind of branched structures that come off, and they kind of make it look like a tree. So we call them, in Latin, of course, the trees. Does anyone know the Latin word for a tree? We call these the dendrites. From dendron for tree, the dendrites. And the dendrites receive signals.
Excuse this interruption of the case. Lila Young, could they please come together?
Yep.
Thank you.
Hi, Lila Young. How are you? I'm well, thank you.
Oh, you're coloring. I was like, what are we waiting for?
Oh, I'm sorry to slow you down there,
No,
Kaylin Clark.
I'm sorry. I apologize.
No, it's okay. I thought I was apologizing to you for wasting your valuable time. No, so there we go. So the dendrites receive signals, and if the signals reach a certain threshold, then a signal will be sent down the axon. In other words, this cell body is receiving a bit of signal, receiving a bit of signal, receiving a bit of signal, but every nerve has a threshold where once a certain level of signal is received, it activates. And they are either on or off. Does that make sense? The signal isn't analog, it's actually digital. Interestingly, like a computer. And a nerve is either actively sending a signal or it is not. It is a little bit analog in how much input it takes to make it go, but its output is digital. Its output is on or off. So let's write that. When sufficient input signal is received from the dendrites, sufficient input signal is received from the dendrites, a signal is sent down the axon. And this is what all nerves basically look like. The physical arrangement can be different. This nerve might be receiving signals from a bunch of different heat sensors, where if any one of those goes, it's going to send a signal to the brain. Other nerves may only have one dendrite, if they are really only connected to one thing. Some may have way more dendrites than that, but they always have one axon. They always send information to one place, even if they've received it from multiple places. And the electrical signal itself occurs by something called the action potential. We don't need to know too much about this. This is actually in the grade 12 curriculum, not the grade 11 curriculum, but I think it's helpful to kind of know how this works. Does that make sense? So at rest, the neuron actively pumps positive ions out of the cell. and we call this the resting electrical potential. So they actually work, and some computers work like this too. Has anyone ever built any like computer circuitry? Anyone ever done like a breadboard computer or anything like that? Yeah. If you have, you'll know that some electrical circuits work like this, where when they're in off mode, they actually have an electrical charge, and when they want to send a signal, they actually cut the charge off. There's a bunch of reasons to design a circuit that way in a computer, but this is the way your neurons work. So at rest, the cell body will look like this, and we have a ton of positive ions on the outside of the cell relative to inside the cell. It's about negative 70 millivolts. So it's a measurable voltage. I mean, that's a voltage you could measure with like just a basic household ammeter. You'd need like real fine wires and like to shove them into your nerves. So don't do that, but you can measure it. And you know, if you get electrode, and then to send a signal, the neuron opens channels that allow all the ions to flow back where they want to go. And of course, if you have a bunch of positive charges all hanging out together, it takes active pumping to make that happen. When you let them go back where they want to go, where do they want to go? It's like if you pump a whole bunch of water to the top of a water tower, it'll stay up there, but as soon as you open the tap, what's going to happen to all that water? It's going to flow down. Likewise, if you pump all the positive ions so they're in the same place outside the neuron, if you're wondering if I just said plausitive, I did.
I didn't hear it.
But if you let all the ions flow, then what would happen is this. So when the cell decides to let it happen, what will happen is they will open channels here. And when those channels open, the positive ions are going to start to flow in. Does that make sense? And I'm going to show, ready? I'm going to show an open gate. Now, if you're asking, is it actually a little open gate like that? It is not. But the positive ions will start to flow in to the neuron. What happens then is this. The next gate over is triggered by positive ions in the cell. So in other words, when these positive ions come in and start to flow, they trigger the next channel over. Does that make sense? And these are kind of on a timer. So the first ones will close back down after a certain amount of time. Just like that, they close back up. But then because of those positive ions in the cell, the next channel over will open up like this. And that will cause ions to flood in there. And this just keeps happening down the way. Does that make sense? So as soon as a signal starts to happen, it is self-propagating because the channels are designed to open up for a little bit when they detect positive ions entering the cell. And this will eventually propagate its way all the way down the axon. So it starts here, and moves down. And then once it has happened, after the signal is sent, the gates all close, the pumps turn back on, and it goes back to rest. So after the signal is sent, the gates close and the pumps turn back on. And those are returned to rest. So I'll take a minute to make sure you can write that down, make sure you got it. That's where we're going to leave it today. Yes, sir?
What is it made of that it can open up and close?
The gates are proteins. Great question. So they're called so the first ones, the very first channels, are controlled directly by this cell, and all the rest of these are called voltage regulated protein ion channels. And basically, they're not actually a gate that opens like this. They actually just kind of open like that. But they're proteins that are designed when a certain voltage is reached inside the cell, they pop open, and they stay popped open until a new voltage is reached when they pop back closed. And then they're designed, they have what's called a refractory period. So they have a period after which they've opened and closed where they basically can't work anymore. And in that time, the pumps are able to get everything back to the resting potential. So the signal goes in one direction, but not in the other direction, because these ones have already opened and closed and they're resting for a bit.
Is that why you have like when you study?
In part, you mostly get tired when you study too much, because like your neurons are actually, like the glial cells that provide energy for them, are actually just get like depleted, and also just like have been working to heat up, and as they heat up, they work less effectively. It's no different than why machines stop working effectively. They are just machines. But yeah, but this does have to do with why the brain can only move so fast.
Cancel the ones that don't have any change.
Because our brain, unlike a computer can actually,
what the sulfuric acid.
and this is why our brain is more complex than computers were 2 or 3 years ago. Now
K plus OH aqueous.
it's kind of and certainly 5 years from now, computers will be far more complex.
The ionics will both
Which
equal
I would argue should worry you.
hydroxide.
But they're also different in that we could never compete with computers for speed, right? Even before computers could start doing some complex thinking, they were always faster than us, because with them, the moment they turn off the signal, it's off, and the moment they turn it on, it's on. And for us, there has to be a gap between on and off because of the way our signals get sent, which is by mechanically pumping little ions in and out of the cell, and you have to give the pumps time to get back to that normal resting state before you can send another signal. Now that's fast. It happens in milliseconds, but it's not instantaneous. Whereas a computer can, at the speed of light, turn a signal on and off and on and off and on and off. Our neurons require more time between signals.
Yeah, but you can train it, right? Because some people have faster reflexes.
That's an interesting thing to talk about. Those are different types of neurons and different types of muscle fibers. You have something called fast twitch muscle fibers, and you have something called, I can't remember what the other ones are, but they're made for endurance, basically to hold on. And different people have different ratios of those. And that's actually not something you can change. So some people are just faster, and some people are just stronger. And some people are neither. I'm here to tell you, I'm sorry, but it's true. But I think I could beat you in a pie eating contest. Pretty confident.
Neurons are that?
Pretty confident. I'll tell you something else. I went for dinner last night, and then my son wanted to roll down a hill. My youngest son. Though my daughter also wanted to roll down a hill, and she's 17. So I rolled down a big hill at a golf course yesterday. And I'll tell you something. When you're 40 and you roll down a big hill, it feels a little less good than when you're like 20 and roll down a hill, or 11. That's some hard-won information I can share with you. Yeah, you're welcome. So we'll talk more about this tomorrow. Again, this particular concept is actually a grade 12 concept. You don't need to know it. It won't be on the test. But I think it's useful to understand how your neurons actually send an electrical signal. Yeah?
What is that?
I didn't hear a word you said. I'm sorry. That's the actual signal. Just showing that because of this rest period, the signal can only move in one direction. It moves down the axon, but it can't move back up the axon. All right, listen up. What's going to be the first thing you do tomorrow? Don't tell me to be quiet. That's not how this works. You're goddamn right, not me. What's the first thing we're going to do tomorrow? A quiz. What's it going to be on? Cardiovascular system.